Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is
Buenos días, buenas tardes.
and I'm supporting the facilitation of the 2021 online edition of Forest Legality Week. And I'd like to informally welcome you to day 2. And in the case of this first session's agenda, I'd like to ensure that those joining in Spanish and French are able to follow the simultaneous interpretation. In this first panel, all presentations will be made in English. So I am just going to take a moment and give some instructions in Spanish, and then I will invite a colleague to support instructions in French. Hola, buenos días, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Amy Marón y estoy apoyando esta edición de la Semana de la Legalidad Forestal 2021. Y como primera instrucción, me gustaría indicarles cómo acceder a la interpretación en caso de que vaya a acompañarnos en español. Por favor, vaya a la barra de navegación de Zoom y seleccione el icono de globo donde dice interpretación y ahí pueden seleccionar el canal del español. Now I'm going to invite Marie to give instructions in French.
Bonjour à tous et en particulier à nos participants francophones. Bienvenue dans cette deuxième journée de l'édition virtuelle 2021 de la Semaine de l'égalité forestière. Une traduction simultanée vous est proposée en français. Pour y accéder, veuillez sélectionner le petit globe où il est indiqué Interprétation dans la barre de navigation Zoom. Vous pourrez ensuite sélectionner la chaîne française. Si vous rencontrez des difficultés avec la traduction simultanée pendant la réunion, n'hésitez pas à nous en faire part dans le chat.
Thank you, Marie. Now we're going to look at a few quick instructions to support everybody's participation today. So I'm just going to look at the next slide with some quick instructions. So I'd like to indicate to those people who may have had the link shared with them, this is particularly important, this second indication. If you can find your user and if you notice that you are connected with someone else's name, I would invite you to navigate up to the right-hand corner of the box of your user and click on the 3 dots and select the option to rename. And then you can just type in your name. And we are going to be using the chat today to support this event, and we will invite you right now if you want to state your name, your organization, where you're connecting from, and we will ask you to submit questions and use the chat throughout this first and the second session. We also would like to make it clear that we are recording today, and with that, we're going to just change over and show you what we did on day 1. And I am going to invite Ruth Nogueron, Senior Associate at World Resources Institute, who will provide a brief summary of the panels that were held yesterday. Ruth, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me, right? Great, thank you. So yes, welcome. Yesterday we had 2 panels. The global pandemic that started 2020 disrupted forest product supply chains significantly. The demand for timber products in global markets rose as people worked from home and invested in remodeling and home repairs. Low interest rates increased housing demand, and as people moved away from cities, home building increased in some markets in the second half of 2020. This put even more pressure on forest operations and mills, which were already facing logistic and workers shortages impacted by COVID and the lockdown. So we had 2 panels yesterday looking at the impacts of COVID on supply chains. The first panel focused on global supply chains in terms of impacts on trade, logistics, and verification processes. The second focus on impacts on the small and medium-sized enterprises. So some of the key messages from the first panel, we heard from Rupert Oliver, who talked about the winners and losers in the global trade of forest products, the role of FLEGT processes, how these processes played in that context. And he also mentioned results of a short survey where people thought that FLEGT licenses make importing wood from Indonesia easier. He highlighted the achievements made in Indonesia through the SVLK, and mentioned that, that those achievements need to be recognized. We heard from Joe O'Donnell, who talked about the US market and some shifts in import products shifting away from China to other countries, including Vietnam. He talked a little bit about also the impacts on auditing processes and changes. We heard from Dan Wackerman, who told us that all global supply chains were dramatically impacted. They are all connected, and even small changes or impacts in one place have big impacts in other places. He talked about impacts in timing, cost, availability of services and equipment. And he said that many of these changes represent paradigm shifts that will be permanent in the long term. We heard from Rob Shaw, who talked about the difficulties that certification and certification bodies and verification organizations face in implementing virtual audits, and some of the adaptations that they had to make during the lockdown. During the second panel, we heard specifically directly from SMEs from Cameroon, Indonesia, and Peru. They also talked about their experiences directly, which range from losing staff, getting sick with COVID, and having personnel shortages, losing access to markets, and on the other side, increased demand for products and some of the challenges that face meeting that demand. We talked a little bit about some of the best practices that emerged during the lockdown, that they are likely to continue, and that including some streamline operations, hygiene protocols, more access, and taking advantage of virtual tools to coordinate and plan. One emerging thread in that discussion was the need to increase training to support SMEs, to strengthen their operations, their ability to comply with legality requirements, and also traceability requirements and access to markets. That is a brief summary of day one, and over to you, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. So now we're going to look at the agenda for today, and I'm going to introduce today's moderator, who will be supporting us. So today we're going to, as you can see now on the screen, we're going to be having two different sessions. So the first session is the Supply Chain Policy 1 session with updates and recent developments. Then we will have a brief break at 10 a.m. Eastern, and we will come back after 30 minutes for the second half of the Supply Chain Policy session, which will focus on what are the implications of forest governance. And to support us in these sessions today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Charles Chip Barber, who is Director of the Forest Legality Initiative at the World Resources Institute, WRI, a global policy-focused nonprofit focusing on environment and sustainable development. Prior to joining WRI, Dr. Barber served from 2009 to 2014 as Forest Division Chief at the U.S. Department of State, and from 2005 to 2009 as Environmental Advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Prior to his government experience and service, he worked as an environmental consultant for numerous multilateral agencies and was also previously with WRI from 1989 to 2001. Over to you, Chip.
Thank you, Amy. And hello, everyone. And thank you for joining today's panel. So, as Amy said, I'm Chip Barber. I direct the Forest Legality Initiative at WRI. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., which is where our global office is located. So we're very pleased to be hosting two panels today on the topic of policy measures related to supply chains for both timber and agricultural commodities. As you all know, key consumer markets have developed laws and different measures focused on preventing the import of illegal timber, such as the Lacey Act here in the United States, the EU Timber Regulation and the associated FLEGT voluntary partnership agreements, and the Australian Illegal Logging Prohibition Act, and there are others. However, as you know, there's an increasing focus on the role played by agricultural commodities in driving deforestation. So various of the consumer markets are now discussing or developing proposed measures to regulate the import of those kinds of agricultural commodities that are linked to forest conversion. Different markets are discussing how various proposed measures focused on those ag commodities might affect and take into account existing legislation and procedures regulating the trade in timber and forest products. So we're looking at the intersection of those two things. In our two panels today, we'd like to provide you with an opportunity to learn more about these proposed measures that are under development in the EU, the UK, and the United States. And we'll also hear the views of a number of representatives from economies on the supply end of this issue. A couple of key questions that I have, and I'm sure maybe some of you share, are this. First, how do these proposed regulations respond to the specificities of different types of commodities and different trade flows? Second, what might be the impact of these new measures on the production and trade of tropical hardwoods, timber from plantations, and pulp? And in that regard, what role do the consumer markets play that are not really pursuing this kind of regulation right now, such as China? And third, how can we get a meeting of the minds between those on the producer side and the consumer side, both in governments and in the private sector and civil society? So that's a lot. That's a lot to talk about. But we're going to give it a go for the next two sessions, hearing from a stellar range of experts. We, of course, want to hear your views and comments, as you heard before, posted in the chat. So our day is going to be divided into these two 90-minute sessions. In the first session, we're going to hear presentations from some very distinguished speakers on current developments in both producer and consumer governments, or in the case of the European Union, to be precise, a regional economic integration organization. These speakers will provide updates and perspectives from Indonesia, the European Commission, the United Kingdom, and the United States. After a break, the second session of the day will be a roundtable discussion with more debate and give and take, including most of the participants from the first session, as well as additional voices from NGOs and the private sector. So as I noted, we encourage you to start putting your questions and comments into the chat during this first session. We're going to try and organize those and get to as many of them as possible during the second session. These are complex topics, and we know there are some differing views on the best path forward in dealing with them. We don't expect, and we're not trying to achieve any kind of a consensus here. We know there's a lot of different proposals out there and views. But I hope at the outset that we could maybe agree on three things, which are pretty basic but important. First, halting tropical deforestation is a key priority for conserving biodiversity, slowing climate change, and ensuring sustainable and equitable paths of development. Second, the evidence is quite strong that the production and consumption of timber and a number of agricultural commodities is a key driver of tropical deforestation and degradation of forests. And third, solutions to this problem really need to take into account the rights, the needs, and the interests of both the producer and consumer economies, as well as key stakeholders in civil society and the private sector. And whatever solutions we come to, if they're going to work, they have to be just and equitable in how they allocate both the burdens of action and the benefits. It was customary in the past, here in the United States at least, to speak of the marketplace of ideas. But more and more, I think with social media, many things going on in the world, a better kind of a metaphor, unfortunately, has become a battlefield of ideas. But at WRI, we still believe in the importance of civil and constructive dialogue. So I ask you to please respect that principle and respect each other, even when we have very different views, as I'm sure we will hear. So with that introduction, let me go on to introduce our first panelist. This is His Excellency Ambassador Arif Havas Oegroseno, sorry, and the ambassador is the current ambassador of the Republic of Indonesia to the Federal Republic of Germany, where he served since 2018. Before that, from 2015 to 2018, he served as the Vice Minister for Maritime Sovereignty in the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime Affairs in Indonesia. Before that, he served as ambassador to Belgium, to Luxembourg, and the EU from 2010 to early 2015. And he's held numerous previous posts before all of that, including Director General for Law and International Agreements and the Director for Political Security and Regional Arrangements. Ambassador, you have the floor, and I will be timing this as was noted. So when I start to hold up my little signs here, you know what's going on there. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I have a presentation that I want to share. Hang on a second. All right, can you all see the presentation fine? All right. So the title is very legalistic, but you'll see at the end what could be the conclusions. So I had a long history with FLEGT, Dr. Barber and colleague, as a young officers all the way back in 2003, 2004, colleague from the NGO. I think they're all here in the session here. There is Pak Abu, there is also Budia, and also Minang. You know, I was involved in the negotiation of FLEGT since the beginning, and also it so happened that I was ambassador in Brussels, and you know, I helped also the process of ratifications, especially in Belgium, where they have 5 parliaments, which is not very easy. And you know, I also took the first shipment, trial shipments of FLEGT license entering into European market. So I have a little bit of experience on the process itself. And this you can all see in the FLEGT itself, but I think it's important for us to reiterate that the pillars of FLEGT VPA is legality, sustainability, social responsibility, and economic benefit. One would argue that FLEGT is legality, legality is not sustainability, but in our context, we have the sustainable forest management included, we have the question of workers' rights included, we have a question of environmental impact assessment included. So in our view, in Indonesian view, Indonesian being, Indonesian NGO, Indonesian governments, FLEGT for us is both legality and sustainability, okay? And we have a number of commitments, and since 2015, we had more than 20 regulations, ministerial circulations, that have been issued as a technical arrangement to fulfill legal issue, sustainability issue, and social aspect. And the FLEGT also create an environment for Indonesia to establish laws and regulations to strengthen traceability of timber and improve supply chain control. And also the treaty also includes implementations of the Indonesia's sustainable forest management system. So our export is doing okay, is going up actually, even in the COVID, dropped a little bit, but now it's going up. Our export to EU is very interestingly not as fast as other market. Although EU is our partner in FLEGT, but the trend is okay, right? And I want to share with you an article that I found in the internet about the implementation in terms of commitment by EU member states. And the place where I represented today, Germany, it has the highest level of formal implementation according to this study. So I was quite happy. I found this article in 2018. I came in Berlin in 2018. I had a long professional and personal contact on FLEGT, so quite excited. I hope that everything is implemented well in Germany and they become an example in EU. So one of the aspects that I look very closely is Article 13 of FLEGT. And Article 13 has a very interesting element of FLEGT, which is FLEGT, I believe, is a combination of legality on one side, sustainability, social responsibility, and economic benefit. So Article 13, the title itself is market incentive, okay? And it is a legal obligation for European Union and its member states to promote a favorable position in the union market for the timber products covered by this agreement. And the legal word is shall. So it's not may, it's not will, but it's a shall. It's a strong legal word that is included in Article 13. And those efforts include, in particular, public and private procurement policies, recognizing more favorable perception of FLEGT licensed products on the EU market, especially the Indonesian SVLK. But it's not translate actually into benefit. Okay, if you look at this number, it's clear that the FLEGT SVLK number from non-FLEGT SVLK is still far below China and the US. Now, this is a global number. You can debate about this, but let me go to a specific relation to my job. So with my eagerness, so I sent out letters to all the minister president and the governors in Germany last August. And I basically asked, are you aware of FLEGT VPA? Are you aware of SVLK? And how do you implement Article 13? And from 16 letters, I received only 3 replies. One minister president said, well, sorry, I'm not aware of SVLK. In our public procurement, we only require FSC and PAFC. Another governor told me, well, I'm not aware. And why don't you discuss at the federal level? And the third one says, yes, I am aware, but I don't trust you. This is a letter. Yes, we are aware, but we are not going to recognize your product as SVLK, FLEGT, whatnot, because it's not sustainability standard. It's legality. So it's not our business. So flat out rejections. And I, of course, spoke to different colleagues why they are not replying, the other 13, and most of them informally said they don't know how to answer my letter. So they better just be quiet. They're not aware. So informally, the local government in Germany, they just didn't aware of FLEGT SVLK. They don't know what's going on. And therefore, in their public procurement policy, they don't implement Article 13. So I sent a letter to the German Central Authority. The German authority in this regard, the CA is the Federal Minister of Food and Agriculture this March on the same issue. And the response was that we are not going to use it as a public procurement because SVLK is just legality. It's not sustainability. So Germany is not going to implement Article 13. of SVLK. So it's very interesting because we can set aside discussions whether or not this legality is sustainability as well. But regardless of that, Article 13 is a legally binding obligations for the EU to implement that. And whether or not it's legality only and not sustainability, then Article 13 should be implemented because it's a legal document and it says shall. But apparently, this is the reality. So if it's in Germany, Article 13 is not implemented, I can bet my bottom dollar that probably all EU member states are not even looking at Article 13 of the FLEGT, where the irony is that in our negotiation with the EU, SEPA, FTA on public procurement, EU push a lot of pressures against Indonesia to open up public procurements in Indonesian governments for EU products. So that would come into a rather strange discussions, no? At a document where you are legally obliged, you're not doing anything, and then you are actually pushing your partners to open up your partners' public procurement for your products. So it's quite interesting situation that we face today. And the conclusion is that, in my view, is it violation? Yes, it is a violation. And Article 20 FLEGT VPA provides a mechanism. Consultation is one of them. GIC is another part of them. Good office is third party, but also arbitrations. So I study in the US. So if you ask me personally, then the last part, just go to the PCA in the Netherlands will be a great idea to take the EU to the court. It will be very interesting exercise to have this kind of discussions at the legal level, at the level of Permanent Court of Arbitrations. But then that's my own opinion. Then I think it's an issue that will be discussed probably, but I want to see what are other countries who are here today, what are their discussions in the EU on this particular thing. You guys should look at this article, market incentive, very carefully. You should link it to dispute settlement mechanism, and I think this is one of the big missing links in the FLEGT today. Now, I want to go into something bigger, not just FLEGT, but TSD, because Dr. Barber mentioned about the importance of trade and sustainability. So our position, Indonesian positions in TSD is very simple. We want to have a comprehensive, robust, and deep trade and sustainable development in the Indonesian SEPA with EU. Comprehensive means all related goods are included, palm oil, vegetable oil, fish, timber. Robust mean we have the right to complain if there are illegal and non-sustainable products coming from our competitors entering EU markets. And deep mean that the compliance on stability should go across the board. So if we found that there is a, for instance, Article 13, that if we believe that EU is in violation, then we will link that to EU access market to Indonesian products with a tariff. And this is our positions. And as far as I learned, the EU does not accept our positions. So you can hear all the story about Indonesia not being a good boy, not being serious in the environment, but this is our official position in sustainable development: comprehensive, robust, and deep. And so far, our colleague in the negotiation refused to have this kind of approach, and the approach is template-based. So they have a template with Singapore and Vietnam, and you know, it's a situation that we still want to see how it develops in the future. So to conclude, I want to also mention about how we perceive discriminatory policy of the EU on the environment. First, I think this is our thinking. We could be wrong. The reason why Article 13 is not being implemented is because there is an industry of certifications in Europe. So that will be preferred than SVLK. Second, in the global EU policy, there is no EU peatland policy. So this is a picture of in Germany, and this is a picture came from one of the famous peatland organizations in Germany, Greifswald Moor Center. And the Greifswald Moor Center said that Indonesia has rewetted 200,000 hectares of peatland, and this is more than EU have ever done in the entire EU history. So the science says that, this is not included in this so-called forest policy with deforestation and import coming to the EU. And last but not least, Dr. Barber, I heard the rumors that EU will leave flag tea. That EU will prefer to have its own, voluntary scheme, and therefore not so much with the legal obligation. So I don't know. But thank you very much for this event, for inviting me to be here. I think what I'm trying to send the message is that you just mentioned, Dr. Barber, the importance of just and equality, the importance of being fair. And I don't think, coming from the bottom of my heart, it's fair for the EU not to implement Article 13, and at the same time coming up with new ideas, either on the forestry issue or the environment issue or the trade sustainability issue, while even Article 13 itself is not even known by the member states at all levels. So I don't know the answer, but I think on the Article 13 itself, my suggestion to the minister would be to enter into dispute settlement, and probably going to arbitration will be interesting and fun. Thank you very much, Dr. Barber.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was very interesting and enlightening, and a strong argument. And so it's quite appropriate now that we pass over to our colleague from the European Commission, who has some thoughts on this to get deeper into this fairly complex but very, very interesting set of issues. So let me now introduce Mr. Hugo Maria Schally. Mr. Schally is head of the Unit for Multilateral Environmental Cooperation, which is in the Directorate for Global Sustainable Development, which is within the Directorate General on the Environment at the European Commission. He's coordinating and developing the Commission's work with international environmental organizations and multilateral environmental agreements, and focuses also on the links between trade and environment. Importantly for us today, Hugo is also in charge of EU policies and legislation for the Commission regarding global deforestation and forest degradation. In his spare time, he also leads on the international trade and wildlife and the thorny issues related to genetic resources access and benefit sharing. A busy man. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Chip, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And certainly, Ambassador, it's a pleasure to see you again. And I was very honored to see that you started your presentation with a picture of a younger myself from the times when we were negotiating the Indonesia-EU FLEGT voluntary partnership agreement, which I would like to take the time to salute is the single achievement of the EU FLEGT regulation VPAs, as this is still the only country that has achieved an operational licensing system. As you know, we are with 15 countries in VPA processes, with some of them much longer than we had been with Indonesia, and none of them has actually achieved operationality for the licensing system. So I think that's a testament to the political will and the achievements of internal reform in Indonesia, which actually are at the basis of this success. And I think that this success is further exacerbated by the fact that, as you said yourself, the trade between the EU and Indonesia in timber products has actually held up in the face of the difficulties that we had in the post-COVID period. Now, I think that what you have been putting forward, and I will take the liberty not to advance any legal arguments. I could have many, but I think it's not the point of this conversation. And I'm certainly looking forward to the next JIC, where we will discuss issues related to the implementation of the FLEGT VPA agreement, including the many changes that Indonesia is currently preparing to the relevant ministerial decrees, where we actually will have to look at, in accordance with the agreement, closer into what if Indonesia is doing is actually in accordance with the spirit and the letter of the agreement. But that's not the point of our discussion today. I think that before entering into the presentation that I had prepared, I need to give a little bit more context. The EU FLEGT Action Plan was established in the early 2000s and led to the establishment of two main legal instruments applicable across the EU. One is the FLEGT regulation, which is the basis for the voluntary partnership agreements. The other is the EU timber regulation that applies across the board. And the two are actually working together. Now, in the follow-up to those, we had further policy developments and policy statements in the EU. And one important one is the communication on further steps to reduce deforestation and forest degradation globally of 2019, which would put forward a set of actions, I think 35, over 5 priority areas. Priority area 1 is to look at the demand side, which is how to address the consumption footprint of EU production and consumption of certain commodities and products on global deforestation and forest degradation. Second is work in a partnership with producer and consumer countries to make sure that on the one hand, consumer markets send the right market signals to producer countries, and on the other side, producer countries are supported, accompanied, and encouraged in their transition to a sustainable form of production, especially with regard to agricultural expansion. Thirdly, work in multilateral and plurilateral fora and work in the context of trade policy. The fourth, looking at the necessary finance and investment climate to make the shift to sustainable agriculture and forestry. And fourthly, to improve scientific basis and data gathering in that regard. So I think what we're discussing today is part of a very broad agenda that the EU has established. And I think it's even broader when you look at the broader context of the European Green Deal, with its circular economy action plan, which is with its biodiversity strategy, which is farm to fork strategy, and some others, which all address to a degree issues related to nature, biodiversity, and sustainable food systems. And I think we have been very open and communicating on that to our partners, how we want to take them along, cooperate with them in the context of green alliances and green partnerships. And I'm very happy that we are currently discussing such an alliance with Indonesia as we speak, which I think is something that we want to progress on since we have so many policy objectives that we share. Now, coming back from that, what we are discussing today is very closely related to the issue of how to create transparent, sustainable, and accountable supply chains for commodities, and how that would impact and relate to the issue of trade in timber. And I think I'm very glad that this issue resonates also in the G7, that it resonates in the context of G20 discussions. And it's also very much part of a preparatory process for the UNFCCC COP26, the FACT dialogue, in which we both, Indonesia and the European Union, participate and actively contribute. So I think that's just for context. And what I would like then to go into in a little bit more detail, and I apologize, Chip, that I will probably not be able to keep your timeline, but I think I needed that additional time to put context to what I was saying, since the ambassador has given a very broad context of his own to the conversation. So I think if I will try to share what I had prepared, I'm sorry, yes, that should be it. So I hope that's, it's always the same. When you try to do it, actually, then you have a problem. Sorry, just 1 second. So, okay.
It's okay. I figured you'd have a few responses probably to our Indonesian colleague, so I'll give you a few extra minutes, don't worry.
Thank you. What I have then, after this contextualizing, have to share with you is how do we deal in the European Union with the priority 1, demand side measures, and in extension with priority 2, working in partnership with producer and consumer markets in that regard. So the first part is we have the system of EUTR and FLEGT regulation that deals with the objective of ensuring that timber and timber products covered by the annex to those regulations are not placed on the EU market. And that is a system of legislation that we are currently subjecting to what we call a fitness check. The fitness check, which says, well, is this legislation still fit for purpose? Is it still proportionate? Does it still meet the objectives? And do we need to change something to it? Do we need to adapt it? Do we need to repeal it? That's a normal way of how do we deal with internal legislations. And there we do base ourselves to a large extent on the experiences that we've made with the implementation of the EU timber regulation and with the negotiation, preparation, and implementation of FLEGT voluntary partnership agreements. And I think in that context, we have come sort of to see that as the ambassador has rightly pointed out, with regard to the EUTR, there are certain issues with implementation in the EU member states, and there are certain things that are not working in the way as they should. And I think that will inform our decision on a possible new legislative proposal that we're working on for this year. We've also looked at voluntary partnership agreements, and there the conclusion that we have on the table is something that has worked well in improving stakeholder participation in a number of countries that we are cooperating with. It has been a great inspiration for forest governance reform. And I have to say, that's not the case of Indonesia, because the voluntary partnership agreement with Indonesia was a follow-up to a forest governance reform that Indonesia had undertaken and completed by the time we were in the final phases of the negotiations. But it also found that implementation, negotiation, preparation, implementation of VPAs is extremely resource and time consuming. And that 15 years after the introduction of the regulation, as I said, there is only one partner country that has an operational licensing system, which is Indonesia. And that only a very small fraction of timber and timber products that enter the EU are covered by valid FLEGT licenses. And that obviously raises questions whether that is a model that should be applicable and pursued in the future in the same way. So that, again, a further contextualization, but now on the work that we're doing on a possible legislation at this point in time. I hope you can see the screen moving, the slides moving. If not, Chip, please give me a shout. So basically looking at the objectives that we would wish to pursue with such a legislation is to minimize the EU's contribution to forest degradation and deforestation worldwide. And through that, we would make a contribution to reducing deforestation and forest degradation at the global level, because in a way that would be our contribution, since, as we have found out ourselves, about a third of all agricultural commodities that may be associated with deforestation and forest degradation are traded globally. And we are actually a market for something like 30–35% of those. So I think we would hit a couple of specific objectives so that we would minimize the risk that such commodities are placed on the market. We would make consumers and EU citizens aware of the impact of the demand for specific commodities. And by extension, we would promote the demand for consumption of commodities that are not associated with deforestation. And we would provide an incentive for financial and economic investors to integrate such concerns into their investment decisions. Now, how would we do that? And clearly, our studies show that the approach that has been taken through the FLEGT processes, which is to look after illegality, has its strong limitations, and in particular has its limitations with regard to a world where the main drivers for deforestation, forest degradation is no longer logging for commercial purposes, but it's agricultural expansion, is agricultural production. So we were looking at how would we actually, what is the new criterion that we would establish? And I think we looked at FAO, and we looked at other work that has been done in the context of the UNFCCC, and said, okay, we'll take a definition of deforestation based on what has been worked on in the international level. That was based on solid science. We'll actually look at something that would apply to production, as is the case for EUTR in the EU as well, and as well as for imported products. And it should be implementable, monitorable, and possible to assess it in practice. So I think that's what we're driving at. And I think what we are still considering is what is the cutoff date that would be underlying that, which means at how far do we actually want to go to see when did the degradation or the deforestation actually take place. And I think there are two ranges of cutoff dates that we're currently discussing still internally. One is 2015, which is the date when we, based on the information we have, a lot of information and a lot of data exists on globally where land conversion has taken place. There is another consideration of saying, okay, but how can we link it to existing international commitments with regard to halting deforestation and forest degradation, which would argue in favor of having a cutoff date of 2020, as this corresponds to the SDGs and the New York Declaration on Forest. What does a cutoff date mean? It basically means production that has taken place on land prior to, let's take the case of 2020, would not be within the scope of this legislation. So anything that is produced on land that was converted or degraded prior to 2020 will actually not be affected by the rules that we are considering. But that, as I said, is still something that we are debating. Now, looking at what are the commodities that we are looking at, and I think that from our point of view, we looked at which were the commodities that through literature, scientific evidence, data, are more often than not linked to forest degradation and deforestation. And we came to a very unsurprising list, which is palm oil, soy, wood, beef, cocoa, rubber, cereals, and coffee. And I would like to add to that that there are more than that, but I think that was the core grid of analysis. And we looked at saying, well, how do we get to see what we do include is for our legislation, which is commodities with the highest global contribution to deforestation and forest degradation, combined with EU consumption of those commodities and the list or the range of derived products. And that is the understanding of how we would construct the final list. And the final list will probably look a little bit different from the ones that we have on the screen here. just as a by comment, there are sort of technical issues to see, do we go for a limited scope, which means only a number of commodities? Do we go for a progressive scope, which is we select a couple of commodities and derived products to begin with? Or do we subject everything from day one? That's still another discussion to be had in the finalization of our work. Now, then we went back and say, okay, what are the options for policy and legislative measures? And we had 20 options to begin with, a lot of things such as voluntary instruments, certification, bilateral agreements, and so on and so forth. And we narrowed it down to 5 options, which are essentially in reality 2, because the starting point was due diligence or a deforestation-free requirement supported by benchmarking. Due diligence is what you have in the EU timber regulation and in other EU regulations right now, such as the conflict minerals regulation and so on and so forth, but enhanced, improved, taking into account some of the experiences from 10 years of implementation of the EU timber regulation. And then we looked at how can we actually make those measures better implementable, how can we complement it? And we came up with 3 ideas out of the 20 that we had. One is we look at benchmarking, which are the countries that present but based on objective data, a high risk of deforestation and forest degradation or a low risk. That's the benchmarking. The second option that we looked at is, can we actually offer to countries the possibility of establishing a mandatory public certification system that we would recognize? And thirdly, can we sort of combine due diligence with mandatory labeling? So looking at the work that we've undertaken so far, from our perspective, it is a combination of 1 and 2 that would represent the best possible solution from our point of view, because it would offer the possibility for producer countries, and I'll hasten to add that EU countries themselves would also be benchmarked, to the possibility to, through internal reforms, governance, and making sure that deforestation and forest degradation actually doesn't happen, to go to a category of low risk, but it also has the risk for any country that has an aggressive deforestation approach to be categorized high risk. So I think that's something that we are looking into closer. The option 5 was an option from our perspective, which was very much focusing on establishing a flat out requirement, and according to reaching that requirement or not, market access to the EU would be regulated. It's an unlikely option because we see a lot of difficulties and uncertainties in regard to that. Now, I would more or less conclude by saying this was action with regard to priority 1 of the EU communication, but there is priority 2, which is working in partnership with producer countries. And that is what we're currently working on together with our colleagues from what is now called the DG for International Partnerships. And that is the establishment of Forest Partnership, and where there would be a number of targets in saying improve forest governance, address issues related to climate change, create decent jobs, look at sustainable forest management, and reduce deforestation and import of products associated with deforestation. So that is, in a way, in our outreach and partnership with third countries, the kind of mirror image on the supply side to the demand side measures that we're contemplating. I think I will stop here and stop sharing. And I think that with the 2 presentations that you now have heard, I think we have a lot to talk about. Thank you, Chip.
Thank you so much, Hugo. Yes, indeed. Given the complexity of these issues and the differing views, it's really good to see 2 such experienced and distinguished people and diplomats who are going to be able to, I'm sure, sort these things out in short order. But there are some other actors on the scene that was not the case back a few years ago. So I would like to move on right away to Helen O'Connor. she's recently joined the UK's Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or DEFRA, as the head for reducing demand on nature. And she's got the responsibility for working on the UK timber regulations, due diligence, and broader policies on forest risk commodities. She previously worked for the UK Department for International Development, or DFID, for almost 20 years as a climate and environment advisor, most recently as senior advisor for Africa. So Ellen, you have the floor to tell us how the UK is thinking about these things.
Thanks, Chip, and thank you to WRI for inviting me to join this session today. And thanks to the two previous speakers as well. I've made many notes. I'm not going to be able to address all the points that were raised, but really welcomed that conversation and the space that you gave to it as well there, Chip. So thank you. So as Chip said, I have been in DEFRA now for, I think it's just over a month. So I'm going to try and do my best to give you an overview of where we're at and our plans on due diligence legislation. I have, with my 20 years of work in Africa and Asia, hopefully kind of bringing that to light in the presentation. So I'm just going to try and share my screen very quickly with you, and then I will quickly go through. So can I check if you can see that?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. So in the interest of time, because I think I'm conscious that we want to also have space later for discussion, I'm going to use this opportunity to just briefly go through a little bit of the background, which I'm sure many of you already know, to our plans on due diligence legislation, and to kind of tell you where we're at the moment. So essentially, back in 2019, the UK government launched what we call the Global Resource Initiative to really respond to this increasing evidence around supply chains and deforestation. And in this slide, I've kind of summarized some of the key pieces of evidence that we use to kind of inform that demand to set up this initiative. Some of this coming from Forest Trends and other organizations who I think are on this call today. So some of the evidence around the role of illegal deforestation in commercial agriculture, and the fact that what was really clear was that apart from timber, there was no legal requirement in the UK for businesses to ensure that the commodities they were using, importing, had not been produced on land that had been deforested illegally. As part of our measures to produce an environment bill, which the UK government is currently moving through Parliament, we ran a series of consultations on a number of issues, including one on what we could do regarding this issue of the supply chain and legislation around commodities. And what we heard back from people as part of that consultation was that more than 99% of people who responded to that process asked the UK to introduce legislation and to do that urgently. So as one of the big priorities, once our primary legislation, the Environment Bill, goes through the Houses of Parliament. So just a little bit more about the Global Resource Initiative, because whilst the due diligence legislation is one piece of the puzzle, the Global Resource Initiative also highlighted a broader range of issues for the UK government to consider. So it was launched in, as I said, in 2019, and it brought together a collection of leaders from business, from finance, government, and civil society to try and look at essentially how the UK could reduce its impact on the global environment through its supply chain. The task force published the recommendations. I've got the date wrong there, but anyway, the task force published the recommendations and produced 14 recommendations in that report. I've included the link there. I hope we can put that in the chat as well, so that you can see not only the the broad scope of the recommendations that the GRI gave us, but also how the UK government is proposing to respond. So for each of the main recommendations, there is a series of kind of work going on behind the scenes. So moving back onto our due diligence measures, essentially what we are currently proposing on the due diligence side is that it will set out mandatory requirements on larger businesses that use forest risk commodities in UK commercial activities. It creates a common floor based on legality, and related to that, I think we see it providing the basis for building partnerships with producer countries around the world to uphold their laws that protect forests and other vital ecosystems. And I know that people may want to come back to that. We're also very keen to try and provide a consistent framework for due diligence across geographies and commodities, and that this work that we're doing will also align with and kind of complement some of our broader work around COP26 and the goals around our work on nature and the nature campaign. I just wanted to, though, kind of remind us, when I talked about the GRI recommendations, we see the due diligence legislation as being one of a whole series of things that we're trying to take forward to support that kind of move to a more, to looking at reducing the impact of our supply chains on the global environment. So this diagram tries to summarize a few of those points. So it talks about some of the other GRI recommendations, but it also kind of talks about the importance of other work which is ongoing. So some of the round tables working with market leaders on certain areas and certain commodities. It talks about our ambitions around COP and COP26, and also the role of our aid and ODA support and how that can play a role in this sort of global effort. So I just want to very briefly, because the primary legislation is going through Parliament at the moment, I'm not going to get into too much detail about the scope, etc., of the legislation. We need to follow our own processes to do that. But essentially, we see the legislation as introducing three main requirements. So the first one will be around prohibition, so stopping businesses using forest risk commodities that was produced on land illegally occupied or deforested. Secondly, that businesses must have a system of due diligence for each of the regulated commodities. And finally, that we must see a report on that due diligence process annually. And that we will be looking to ensure that parts of those reports will be published for full transparency. We are looking at businesses which don't comply with those to be potentially subject to fines or other civil sanctions. And the Secretary of State, so the Secretary of State for the Department for Environment will be responsible for issuing those fines alongside, supported by a regulator who will help us with the enforcement. And I wanted to also flag that there will be a review clause in the legislation looking to review how implementation is going, etc., every 2 years. So just very briefly, as a forward look, and I know there may well be people who want to know far more detail about which commodities and which businesses. Firstly, the Environment Bill, which is essentially that the framing legislation, which enables us to then move this due diligence legislation forward, that is going through our House of Parliament at the moment, and we are hoping that it will be essentially passed into law later this year. And we hope that, again, later this year, we'll be able to launch the consultation on due diligence. And it's at that point that we will be looking to use that consultation to help us think about and kind of clarify which commodities, which businesses, the size of businesses will fit in the scope. So we're doing some initial thinking, but this consultation is absolutely key for us to kind of really think through what becomes in scope of the consultation. As a standard, it will go on an online portal. We are keen to maximise participation. And so I just think, as an example, just using online portal, for example, in the first consultation that we ran, we got more than 60,000 responses to that. And again, I've included the link there so people can see the kind of how that was run on the online version. But as I said, we're keen to kind of expand and have maximize the participation in the consultation once that process starts. And then hopefully, as a result of that consultation, we will respond to the issues and the suggestions that people raise and use that to help shape our final format for the legislation, which will hopefully come forward at some point in 2022. So I am going to stop sharing that now. And apologies, that was a kind of process overview. As I said, we are, because it's going through primary legislation at the moment, there are certain aspects which hopefully will become easier to kind of talk about as we launch that formal consultation later in the year. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen. Wow, so when I said in the beginning, there are some varying approaches and perspectives on a common problem. I guess I wasn't just making that up, but that was fascinating to hear. We'll have a chance to talk about it in the next session. But right now I'd like to pass directly on to hear a bit about how this is being thought about in the United States, particularly in the US Congress. And to give us a briefing on that, I'd like to introduce Rick Jacobson, who is the manager of commodities policy in the United States Office of the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA, where he's working to advance demand-side policies and regulations to tackle commodity-driven deforestation. He also focuses a lot on Brazil, so very apropos. He used to work at Global Witness for 10 years, and he is a returning veteran of Forest Legality Week. He has spoken for us before in various capacities, and most importantly, he's closely following the complex discussions that are underway now in the US Congress on proposed legislation which would deal with the effects of imports of agricultural commodities on tropical forests. So you have 10 minutes, David. Sorry, Rick. David's next. You have 10 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chip. It's great to be here. We appreciate the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what's happening here in the US. I'm having a little trouble finding the share button on my screen, so give me just 1 minute to see if I can figure this out.
Should be on the bottom bar and be green.
There we go.
There you go.
Great. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about the context in the US in terms of what is already in place with regards to supply chain due diligence precedents, and then talk a little bit about a few initiatives, legislative initiatives that are being considered at the federal level and also in a couple of US states. I won't introduce EIA. I think many are familiar with our work in the timber sector, and as Chip mentioned, our UK and US offices are both involved in trying to advance demand side policies and regulations on commodities. So just to start with, I wanted to mention a few supply chain due diligence laws that are already on the books in the US. I think maybe most relevant to this discussion is the US Tariff Act for since the 1930s has had a prohibition on products made from forced labor entering the US. And a few years ago, a loophole was removed from that legislation, which has allowed customs to act more assertively in trying to make sure that forced labor products from forced labor are not entering the US. And we've seen just in the last year that result in some decisions to exclude some commodities that are associated with forced labor, such as palm oil and cocoa, but I think the point here is that it really shows that there is a will, on the part of customs to make sure that there's trade rules are being used to promote fair competition. So some other ones that exist that I won't go into in much detail. There's quite detailed import declaration requirements for high risk fisheries. Fish products associated with illegal fishing. There's been a conflict mineral provision requiring importers to report on due diligence measures they're taking to make sure that minerals that they import into the US, either in raw form or in finished products, are not funding armed conflict. And then of course there's the Lacey Act amendment on the import of plant products. So I think most relevant to the discussion here today is a piece of legislation that Senator Schatz and Representative Blumenauer have been developing. I think taking some lessons from the Lacey Act and these other existing precedents that would prohibit the imports of commodities produced on illegally deforested land. So I'm going to spend some time talking about where that legislation is at. It's not public. It hasn't been formally introduced, but discussion drafts have been circulated to stakeholders, and there's been quite a lot of discussion behind the scenes about this. I also wanted to just mention briefly that there are other discussions about due diligence, broader due diligence on human rights and the environment within U.S. corporate business practices. So the Schatz and Blumenauer bill isn't the only game in town, but it's quite advanced and it's something that we are expecting to see introduced later this year. So just a run through of what's being proposed in the U.S. legislation. As I mentioned, there would be an import prohibition. So this would mean that certain agricultural commodities grown on illegally deforested land would not be allowed into the U.S., either in raw form or in the form of manufactured products. I wanted to note that free, prior, informed consent and land tenure rights, as they are recognized in the producer country's legal framework, would be included in the definition of what is illegal. So violations of FPIC and land tenure would be considered. A due diligence obligation would take the form of importers being required to submit information upon import to US authorities about their supply chains, detailed traceability information, and also steps that they've taken to comply with the import prohibition. And these import declaration requirements would be appropriate to the level of supply chain risk. So there would be a process of identifying what supply chains are high risk and therefore would demand more information be provided for products involving those supply chains. In terms of product scope, similar scope to, I think, what has been mentioned as being considered in the EU and UK contexts, with cattle, soy, palm oil, cocoa, rubber, and pulp right now being considered as priorities. And in the case of cattle, I wanted to point out that that's a range of cattle products, not just beef, but also leather. The US is a major importer of leather products with high risk of deforestation. The import declaration requirements would apply to specific products that would be designated in the law, but also there would be a review process, a regular review process to consider what other commodities and what other products containing those commodities may need to be added in the future to make sure that the bill is really getting at the drivers of deforestation and the risk that the US market is exposed to. So in that sense, it's a progressive, the proposal is progressive, like was mentioned in the European context. Another key element of this is recognizing the importance of engagement between the US government and its partners, its trade partners. So there are provisions being developed that would create new avenues for foreign assistance and also for engagement with the US to try to help countries address the underlying governance issues that are leading to illegal deforestation. So that is an important component, and it recognizes the need to consult with a range of stakeholders, not just governments, but civil society and local communities, indigenous peoples, as part of those discussions. On enforcement, there would be civil and criminal penalties for non-compliance. There would also be a third-party complaint mechanism by which anyone, domestic or international, can submit evidence of violations of the provisions. So this is not unlike the substantiated concern provisions in the EUTR. The bill would also include measures to tackle financial crimes related to illegal deforestation. So in other words, essentially considering illegal deforestation as a money laundering offense. And then finally, the bill would create a preference in federal government procurement for zero deforestation products. So this is not just illegal, but essentially a sustainability preference for U.S. government suppliers. So that's kind of in a just a top line way what's under consideration. Again, we expect and hope that the bill will be introduced later this year, and there's a broad civil society support and a coalition that's really trying to help advance these measures. And then lastly, I wanted to switch gears and mention a couple of state level pieces of legislation that are in the works. So in California, there is currently a public procurement bill that is making its way through the state legislature. It has recently, just this month, passed the state assembly. So now it's moving next month into the state Senate, and is believe that there's support from the governor should this get passed out of the legislature this year. So this law would essentially require state suppliers of the state government to have in place policies that would exclude products made wholly or in part from commodities produced on land subject to deforestation or intact forest degradation in tropical or boreal forests, and report publicly on the implementation of those policies. The policies are pretty detailed. The requirements of the policies, expectations is fairly detailed in how it's outlined in the bill, and would include traceability, free, prior, informed consent, and compliance with producer country laws. And just briefly to mention, the New York state legislature has introduced a very similar public procurement law that also differs slightly in that it would, as it was introduced this year, it proposed to strengthen an existing prohibition under state law on the use of tropical hardwoods from natural forests. So that bill did not progress in the legislative session this year. So the senators behind it have already indicated their intention to reintroduce it next year. So that's what I wanted to cover. And I think I may have gone over briefly, but yeah, thanks a lot and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Rick. No, you were just about right on time, but in the interest of time, because we do have to stop fairly close to 10 for this, and we'll have lots of time afterwards for lots of discussion and perspective. So I would finally like to turn to David Saddington, because we really want you to explain how we're going to get producers and consumers and all the stakeholders to talk to each other in a constructive way to sort through this very complicated landscape, which we've heard about. So David Saddington is head of the Nature Campaign for the 26th Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change in the UK presidency, COP26, that will convene this coming November. He sits in the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, or BASE, and he is leading the dialogue on forest, agriculture, and commodity trade, or FACT, which is an innovative effort, which by chance is co-chaired by Indonesia, which we heard from, in the beginning. The idea is to foster producer-consumer dialogue on the issues that we're considering today. So we're going to turn it over to David to tell us the facts about FACT. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Chip. And I think, yeah, it's quite a nice final presentation, I hope, because I think it goes back to the comments which you said very much at the start around how do we ensure the meeting of minds on this. And of course, we've seen a flavour of that today, because the FACT dialogue, the forest agricultural commodity trade dialogue, very much is around bringing producer and consumer countries together to globally agree what that vision is and those actions are to achieve sustainable land use and commodity trade. If I got specifically into FACT, just contextualizing this within COP26 itself, climate change conference happening this November in Glasgow. Nature is a key campaign for COP26. It is an absolute priority for the Prime Minister, for the presidency. We are really proud to put nature right at the heart of the climate change conference, and working very closely with China on this as well, making sure we do have that join up between the biological convention, which they are hosting in October, and our COP on climate in November, which will be very excited to make sure we are tackling the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis throughout this work on FACT. And really what we want to achieve in FACT when it comes to tackling commodity-driven deforestation. I don't need to sort of remind you all around sort of, why we're doing this around the numbers, but of course we know the urgency of this challenge and how tackling this is so fundamental in order to have that restoration of ecosystems around the world. But in terms of the FACT dialogue, really what this is all about is a government-to-government dialogue, and that really inclusive vision. So like I said, we want to bring together the most important producer and consumer countries of globally traded agricultural commodities, such as palm oil, such as soy, such as cocoa, timber, for example, but to do so in a way which is very much in that sort of non-discrimination sense, and have that meeting of the mind to agree that way forward. We have had some successes so far. We did publish a joint ministerial statement, which was signed on the 27th of May by 24 countries, agreeing to this collaborative way of engaging in tackling the sustainability of these core supply chains. This was including Indonesia as our co-chairs on this, but also Brazil, Malaysia, Ghana, for example, some really key producer countries, and it was also backed by a critical mass of consumer countries as well, including at the G7 a few weeks ago. And we were very keen to see the explicit reference to FACT in the G7 communique. Importantly, that this was picked up by trade ministers as well, because of course, as has been picked up by a few people on the call today, making sure that we do land this with the trade perspective and not just the climate and environment guys is crucially important in order to actually have that market shift, which we all want to see. In terms of some of the participants, you can see there on the screen, but yeah, we do have that really sort of strong buy-in from key countries, and really exciting to have China around that table as well, engaging. I have seen some comments around China in the chat, which is fantastic, because of course, we must look at the numbers on this and actually how important it is to engage China, India, some of those large Asian markets when we talk around consumers, making sure that it does stretch beyond, of course, the high ambition we do have in Europe, what sort of Hugo was talking about there. And we are really delighted to have Indonesia as our co-chairs of this dialogue, really sort of furthering the UK and Indonesia relationships and working with ministerial counterparts over there to make sure this dialogue does absolutely make sure we are putting those producer voices at the heart of the FACT dialogue and working through these solutions together. And by solutions, I'm very much now talking about the roadmap for action, which we are crafting in advance of COP26. So after that ministerial meeting, we have commenced technical working groups in 4 specific areas, the first being trade and market development, the second around supporting smallholders, the third around transparency and traceability metrics, and then the fourth around research, development and innovation. And each of those groups, they are led by co-champion countries. So we have really strong country support within those 4 working groups. And within each of those groups, officials are now working to put pen to paper on some of those collaborative roadmaps, which we will be unveiling at COP26, which we think is very exciting and hopefully a really great step forward in terms of collaboratively tackling this global challenge. So I would encourage any sort of government spokespeople online to make sure you are engaging with your sort of host governments who are engaging in those dialogues happening over the next few months. The next round there is the 19th of July. Of course, the reason we set up FACT is very much to fill that sort of gap around government to government collaboration in the space, but we couldn't achieve this huge ambition of trying to transition the market into sustainability without including civil society organizations and businesses, which is why for the FACT dialogue at COP26, we have partnered with the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is part of the World Economic Forum group. I'm sure we're very familiar to you all, Justin Adams and his great team there, to make sure that we are bringing in Indigenous voices, civil society organizations, business leaders, to make sure that their thoughts, their innovative ideas are feeding through into those government roadmaps and making sure that governments are hearing those fantastic ideas from that community of experts there, and actually just making sure that we are sort of working in harmony with that group of sectors as well, and making sure that all of those corporate commitments, for example, around forest positive, are supporting the work of the FACT dialogue. And in order to achieve this vision, of course, we need private as well as public finance flowing into those sustainable supply chains. With my final words, again, apart from just encouraging you all to engage in the FACT dialogue over the coming months, whether it be through the government, organizations, or via the Tropical Forest Alliance, if you are a business or civil society organization, I would say that this is something which we do see lasting beyond COP26, because of course, this has been a global challenge for decades. And in order to turn this around, we cannot do that in one sort of year. It is part of a collaborative process, a deep collaborative process, which we're looking to, of course, ground this year in COP26, but we are very much in sort of foundation laying. So we do want to see the FACT dialogue continue to grow and evolve to implement the actions in the roadmap in the coming years beyond COP26, and hope to see many of you there engaging in this dialogue and delivering on this very ambitious action. Thank you very much, Chip. A really, really fascinating session. I look forward to a lot of the collaboration which will come out of this. Back to you.
Thank you very much, David. That was a great succinct thing, and you brought it in on time. We are scheduled to wrap up right now to take a brief break. I was going to check just very briefly, 1 minute. I thought maybe, having started out, the ambassador might have a comment or two. I know I was thinking of going back to him, but he may have had to jump off. Yes, you're there. So if you can just give us 1 or 2 minutes of reaction, since there's been a lot since you first spoke, that would be great, because we do have to conclude this in a minute or so. Please.
Not much, Dr. Barber. I think I just want to underline again that FLAGT treaty is a legal document. It's a document that contains legal obligation on both sides. Indonesia has to honor its obligations. The EU has to honor its obligation as well. And I think this is a very important issue for other countries if they want to replicate us. And also it is important also for Indonesia to see whether the balance, you know, of interest is being protected or not. I'm not saying that if EU does not honor its agreement, then we will start cutting forests. No. In our discussions in 2002, 2003 internally, we saw that there was a lot of wrongs being done by the previous regime. And we had to do something as the younger generations. So 2003, government officials, young officials like myself, NGOs, and a very interesting colleague, Julian Newman from London, from EIA came, and I met him, and he's very passionate. So, you know, there was a lot of good thing going on as young officials in Foreign Office and forestry to do something good for Indonesia. So it's for us, okay, for my generation, for my future generation. It's very clear. And then along the line, the EU comes in, and we were very happy that EU willing to engage us. So I think that is the most important aspect that we have with the EU. So, and I think it's very important that we have a clear message from the EU, you know. What is it that you want? Legality, sustainability, market access. I'll give you another example, Dr. Barber. Nothing to do with forest, but this is very crucial. We have arrested and sunk 600 foreign fishing vessels, including from China, including from our neighboring countries, because they are doing illegal fishing in our waters. We are IUF free, we are very tough, and our product is very well known at respecting human rights, and we are fighting illegal fishing, okay? But when we export to EU, tuna from the Pacific, we are slammed with 20% tariff. The reason being is simple, that there is an EU fleet fishing in the Pacific. So we are a competition for the EU. There's a Spanish fleet fishing in the Pacific and fishing in the Indian Ocean. So then the message is not clear. It's about sustainability or it's about business. So we can sell to Japan, of course, we can sell to the US, not a problem, but the message has to be very clear. Minerals, there's someone asked about the minerals. People say, don't buy minerals from Indonesia. So we ban export of minerals like nickels, and we are now taken to WTO because EU is not happy with the ban of our nickels. So what is it that you want? So you have to be clear.
I'm sorry to have to cut you off, but we're about to lose the interpreters, and we have a lot of non-English speakers. So thank you very much for those last thoughts. You've given us a lot to think about, as of all of the panelists. So thanks very much. Just before we lose the interpretation, I just want to say we're taking a break until the half hour, so about 25 minutes from now, so we can prepare the next set presentations and everything like that. We hope you'll, maybe Amy, if you'd like to give the word. I think everyone should basically sign out and then sign back in at the half hour. Is that correct, Amy?
So we're gonna push people back into the waiting room, those that aren't speaking the next session. And if you prefer to disconnect, you can use the same link to come back in at the half hour mark. That's the other alternative.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. This has been fascinating, and we've got a whole other 90 minutes to get into this and have a roundtable discussion. So we'll see you very soon.